The $30 billion I controlled felt heavier than the marble floors I walked across, and tonight I was here to watch the sound of crystal crack. 5 years after being fired from my own family's company, I finally walked back into their world, the marble floors, the gold-trimmed banisters, and that scent of pine and perfection that used to define my parents' idea of success. The Grant Mansion in Aspen glittered like a snow globe, flawless from the outside and freezing within. I told myself I was just here for one evening to keep up appearances. But as soon as I set down the small gift I'd brought, my father's laughter cut through the carols. "Don't worry, Emily," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "We'll make sure you can afford a plate this year." The room erupted in laughter. Everyone except me. The table gleamed with crystal and silver like a photograph in a lifestyle magazine. The chandelier above scattered gold light across the mahogany. Catching on the glasses of champagne my family lifted like trophies. Outside, snow fell soundlessly over the mountains, covering the world in calm that didn't reach this room. Inside, every word sparkled with status. Every glance measured worth. I felt like a ghost moving through someone else's Christmas. The perfection was not warm. It was the cold, hard gleam of expectations. Dad Richard Grant, 68, still carried himself like the CEO he once was. Shoulders squared, voice booming. Even in retirement, he spoke as if he still ran the markets themselves. "Stocks up 20% this quarter," he said to no one in particular. The Grant name still means something in finance. Mom Vivian fluttered beside him in red silk, adjusting her diamond bracelet every few seconds. "It's all about appearances, dear," she liked to say. She didn't need to say it tonight. Everything about the evening screamed appearances. Across the table, my brother Ryan poured more wine into his fiancée's glass. Ryan had inherited Dad's arrogance, but not his restraint. He was the golden son, the one who stayed in the family business, the one who did things right. His fiancée, Chloe Bennett, leaned close to whisper something in his ear, and they both laughed. She was beautiful in that sharp-edged way, glittering, loud, expensive. "Emily," she said, flashing me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's been forever. What are you up to these days? Still doing that little thing?" She tilted her head like she was talking to a child. Before I could answer, Ryan chimed in. "She was working as a receptionist somewhere, right?" He didn't bother to hide the smirk. After leaving the company, Dad chuckled. "She wasn't fired, sweetheart," he told Chloe. "She was just not a good fit for management." "We all have our strengths," Mom added smoothly. "We just wanted her to find something less stressful, that's all." The words slipped around me like familiar chains, polite, polished, humiliating. I kept my smile in place, though it felt like glass. "I'm managing fine," I said softly. Dad raised his brows. "Managing, is that what we're calling it?" He laughed again, reaching for his glass. "Well, at least someone's paying your rent. Hopefully." My fingers tightened around my napkin, but I stayed quiet. I'd learned the power of silence. Let them talk. Let them believe what they needed to. Mrs. Lopez, our longtime housekeeper, appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of roasted duck and winter vegetables. She gave me a small, knowing smile, the kind that said she saw more than she let on. "Merry Christmas, Miss Emily," she whispered as she passed. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. As the plates were served, Chloe leaned forward, her voice syrupy sweet. "You should have seen the guest list at Ryan's firm's Thanksgiving dinner. The mayor, a senator's wife, people who really made something of themselves." "Not everyone's into politics, Chloe," I said. Still smiling. "Of course," she replied. "Some people just don't have the connections." Ryan laughed again, loud enough to make sure Dad heard. Mom sipped her wine. "It's all right, dear. Not everyone has to be successful. Some people bring other kinds of value to the family." That stung more than anything else. Other kinds of value, that was her way of saying none at all. I watched the snow through the window, my reflection faint against the glass. Once I dreamed of being part of this family with pride. But years of cold smiles and cutting remarks had turned me into the quiet daughter who no one expected anything from. Maybe that was my greatest advantage now. They'd never see me coming. Dad raised his glass again. A toast to the family, even the ones who can't handle real business. The laughter that followed filled the room like static. My heart tightened, but my expression remained still. I met his eyes and lifted my own glass. To lessons learned, I said, my tone calm even. Some of us take a little longer, but we catch up eventually. His grin faltered for half a second. Then he barked out another laugh. Just make sure those lessons pay the bills, sweetheart. Mom dabbed at her lipstick and murmured, Richard, really? But she was smiling too. In that moment, something inside me went perfectly still. The old me would have broken down, argued, begged for respect. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I reached for my phone beside the plate, pretending to check the time. The screen lit up with a single notification at the top. Aldridge Private Wealth, Ms. Grant, your transfer of $30 billion has been finalized. Congratulations on your new account status. I blinked once, then locked the screen and slipped the phone into my clutch. My pulse steadied. Not yet. Mrs. Lopez caught the flicker of movement. Our eyes met. I saw her confusion, then a dawning understanding. I placed a finger against my lips. She nodded almost imperceptibly and turned back toward the kitchen. The conversation at the table rolled on, empty and predictable. Ryan talking about shares. Dad analyzing the market, Chloe name-dropping the Forbes list she swore Ryan would make someday. You know, Dad said it's all about control. People who lose control lose everything. He glanced at me as if reminding me of my past. That's what happened when you left Emily. You lost your grip. I smiled faintly. Or maybe I just learned a different way to hold it. He frowned, uncertain if I'd meant it as a compliment or a challenge. Mom rose to refill her glass. Anyway, let's keep the mood festive, she said quickly. It's Christmas, not a board meeting. Of course, I murmured, still watching the snow outside. The grandfather clock struck 9, its deep chime echoing through the hall. The fire popped, scattering tiny sparks. Somewhere upstairs, the old piano began playing a soft carol Mrs. Lopez is doing, I was sure. For a moment, the laughter dimmed, and all I could hear was the ticking clock and my own breathing. I thought about the years I'd spent rebuilding my life, working 16-hour days, investing quietly while the world ignored me. I thought about every insult, every dinner like this, every time they'd looked right through me. And then I thought about the message glowing on my phone. They thought I came back broke and desperate. What they didn't know was that the woman they mocked over dinner owned more shares than all of them combined. I set down my glass, letting the crystal click softly against the table. The sound was almost lost beneath the music, but it made Dad glance up. For a second, our eyes locked, his full of pride and control, mine calm and unreadable. I smiled. Merry Christmas, Dad. He nodded dismissive, already turning back to his guests. But I didn't mind. Tonight was only the beginning. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the frozen world in white. Inside, the candles flickered over faces too sure of their power to see what was coming. I leaned back in my chair, my expression serene as the clock's final chime faded into silence. They thought I was their failure. But this Christmas, I was their lesson. 5 years earlier, the conference room at Grant Holdings had felt more like a courtroom than a workplace. The walls were glass, the air thin and cold. I'd spent 3 years working my way up from receptionist to project manager, dreaming of one day proving to my father that I could handle more than just his last name. Instead, I stood there, palms damp, as he flipped through a stack of papers that would end my career before it truly began. This report is embarrassing, Dad said flatly, not looking at me. Over budget, behind schedule, sloppy execution. I swallowed hard. The team had issues with the supplier. I submitted a proposal to, he raised a hand. Excuses don't balance numbers, Emily. Our clients don't care about reasons. They care about results. Around the long table sat 6 men in suits, all older, all silent. Ryan, my brother, occupied a seat at the far end. His tie immaculate, his expression unreadable. He'd joined the company a year before me, already climbing faster thanks to Dad's mentorship. I searched his face for any sign of support. There was none. Dad tossed the report onto the table. Grant Holdings doesn't reward mediocrity, not even in the family. You'll step down immediately. HR will handle your transition paperwork. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. You're firing me? He leaned back, arms folded. You'll thank me one day. Failure builds character, assuming you can afford to keep learning. A murmur of laughter drifted from someone near the window. I felt my face heat. Dad, I said quietly, I worked for this. You told me if I proved myself, I told you to earn it, he snapped. And you didn't. Mom had always said my father's worst habit was confusing control with love. I saw it clearly that day. He wasn't angry about the project. He was furious that I'd tried to lead on my own terms. The meeting ended without ceremony. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped back, and one by one they filed out. Ryan lingered. It's not personal, he said softly, though his eyes gleamed with triumph. Dad just expects perfection. Perfection or obedience? I asked. He smirked. Same thing here. By the time I reached the elevator, I was trembling. My entire life had revolved around that building, late nights, double shifts, endless attempts to prove I belonged. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, tired, small, humiliated. I promised myself I'd never let them see me beg. I packed my office in silence. The receptionist, my replacement, offered an awkward smile. Mr. Grant said to wish you luck. Luck, the currency of people without power. Outside snow was falling just like tonight 5 years later. I walked 3 blocks before my legs gave out. I sat on a bench near the plaza, the December wind cutting through my coat. The city lights blurred through tears I hadn't meant to shed. My phone buzzed Mom. I almost didn't answer. Emily. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed. You'll be coming home. I assume I'll find my own place. Don't be ridiculous. People will talk, will say you're taking time off. I'm not ashamed, I said. Well, we are, she replied before hanging up. That night I rented a studio apartment the size of my old walk-in closet. The ceiling leaked. The radiator rattled. But it was mine. I spent Christmas alone eating takeout noodles in the cold studio that felt miles away from the warmth of the aspen fire. The Grant family photo appeared in the local business journal, Dad, Mom, Ryan, and his girlfriend smiling in front of the company tree. The caption read, "The family behind Colorado's most trusted investment firm." My name wasn't mentioned. The following months were survival in slow motion. I sent out resumes, took interviews that went nowhere. Every rejection email ended the same. We're pursuing candidates with stronger references. Stronger meaning approved by my father. My savings dwindled. I worked temporary jobs answering phones, managing schedules, anything that paid rent. People called me the broke daughter of the Grant Empire. It stuck. The lowest point came one snowy night in February. I stood outside Grant Holdings' glass tower watching lights still burning on the top floor. Ryan's office, probably. I wondered if he ever thought of me or if I'd already been erased. My reflection looked back at me, hair, frizzy coat, worn, thin face, pale under the streetlight. For the first time, I didn't recognize myself. Then came the twist of fate disguised as a disaster. One of my temp jobs placed me as a receptionist at a small financial firm, Whitman & Pierce. They handled clients the Grants would have sneered at tech startups, independent inventors, crypto investors, before crypto meant anything. I sat at the front desk, answering phones, taking notes, learning everything I could. Numbers had always made sense to me, even when people didn't. One afternoon, I overheard a meeting between the partners and a young entrepreneur from San Francisco. They dismissed him quickly, saying his digital finance concept was too risky. After he left, I found him downstairs at the cafe, pacing, furious. Sorry, I said, I heard what happened. Alex looked at me surprised. They don't get it. The whole financial system is changing and they're blind. I hesitated. Tell me about it. We talked for an hour, then another. By nightfall, he offered to show me his prototype, an app designed to decentralize global investment pools. I didn't understand all the code, but I understood the potential. He needed organization. I needed purpose. We became partners the following week. He named our venture Morningstar Capital. The next 2 years were chaotic, sleeping 4 hours a night, coding in cafes, pitching to investors who laughed at the idea of a young woman handling billions. But I'd learned from the grants people underestimate what they can't control. Every no became fuel. Every failure data. Slowly the numbers turned. 1 investor led to 5. 5 led to 50. By the 3rd year, our assets exceeded $2 billion. By the 5th, 30. I read about my father's company's decline in the Forbes newsletter last fall. Poor investments, shrinking returns, internal disputes. Ryan had taken over as acting CEO, but the stock was crashing. Grant Holdings down 40% this quarter. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. That's when Aldridge Private Wealth reached out. Ms. Grant, your portfolio has qualified for elite client management. We'll assign you a dedicated banker. The irony was perfect. The daughter they'd mocked as broke had become one of their top clients. I stared at my reflection in the mirror that day, no longer small, no longer desperate. The same eyes but sharper now. The same name but a new legacy. And yet when the Christmas invitation arrived this year, handwritten in Mom's looping script, something in me hesitated. Family Christmas Eve dinner. Aspen Estate. We'd love for you to join us. 5 years ago, I'd left that house in disgrace. This year, I would walk back wearing the same quiet smile. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, for recognition. They had bought my silence. Now I would purchase their attention. As I folded the invitation and slipped it into my purse, I felt the faintest tremor of anticipation. The time for silence was ending. They had called me broke. Soon they'd call me something else entirely. The envelope had been cream-colored, thick as money, sealed with the Grant family crest pressed in gold wax. I found it in my mailbox on a cold November morning, sitting neatly among bills and subscription offers. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the elegant script of my mother's handwriting curling across the front like it belonged to another century. Ms. Emily Grant. No dear, no warmth. Just a summons. Inside was a single card, handwritten, formal, and perfectly phrased. Family Christmas Eve dinner, Aspen Estate. We'd love for you to join us. Dad and I are eager to see you. Ryan and Chloe will also be there. RSVP appreciated. The words felt rehearsed, sanitized. Even the paper smelled like control. I sat at my kitchen counter, coffee growing cold, and laughed. For 5 years, nothing. No calls, no messages, no birthdays, not even a note when Forbes had run an article about Morningstar Capital, calling it the future of decentralized finance. They hadn't reached out when my company hit $1 billion in managed assets. But now suddenly I was eagerly invited. For a week I didn't respond. The card stayed on my desk, buried under contracts and reports. Every time I saw it, a strange pull tightened in my chest, half anger, half curiosity. Mrs. Lopez called me one evening to check in, her voice warm and cautious. "Your mother's been talking about Christmas," she said. "They're hosting something big this year. Sponsors, investors, even a senator, I heard." "Of course they are," I muttered. "You should come, Miss Emily," she said softly. "Not for them, for yourself." That thought lingered. Maybe she was right. I didn't need their approval, but maybe I needed to face what was left of them, to see the empire that had once decided I wasn't enough. 2 days later, I texted my mother a brief response. "I'll be there." The reply came instantly. "Wonderful, darling. The dress code is formal." Formal. That single word carried every ounce of her obsession with appearances. I almost deleted the message, but instead I let it stay. Sometimes it's useful to know your opponent still plays by the same rules. In the following weeks, I buried myself in work. Morningstar Capital was expanding into Asia. Negotiations were delicate. My team called me CEO with reverence, but I still remembered being the broke receptionist. Every victory felt like quiet revenge. When Forbes reached out again this time, asking to feature me in their Under 40 Billionaires issue, I almost said no. Almost. Then I thought of my father polishing his whiskey glass while saying, "She's playing entrepreneur." We all need hobbies. The photographer came to my Manhattan office for the shoot. "Can you give me something confident but not cold?" he asked. I gave him a look that could melt steel. Later, as I reviewed the proof, I thought about sending a copy to my parents just to watch them choke on their own words. But no, better to let them find it themselves. By mid-December, my banker from Aldridge called to confirm year-end transfers. The final number, the one my father used to throw around like a prophecy, was now quietly settled in my portfolio. The irony tasted delicious. The night before my flight to Aspen, I stood by the window of my penthouse overlooking the city. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals, muffling the sounds of traffic. For a moment I wondered what it would feel like to walk into that house again, the scent of pine and expensive perfume, the weight of judgment in every look. I whispered to my reflection, "We made it back." Not for them, but for the lesson they refused to learn. The private car arrived at dawn, sent by my family, of course. The driver handed me an itinerary typed on letterhead. Dinner begins promptly at 7:00 p.m. Guests include the Bennett family partners from Grant Holdings and several VIPs. So that was it. They weren't inviting me home out of affection. I was being paraded either as an act of pity or as a prop in their social theater. Either way, I could play my part. The flight to Colorado was quiet. I worked through emails until the plane descended over the snow-covered peaks. Aspen looked exactly as I remembered, gleaming, perfect, untouchable. When the car turned onto the long, tree-lined drive leading to the Grant estate, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The house came into view, massive and gleaming windows glowing like golden eyes. The gates opened automatically as though even the security system still recognized my name. Mrs. Lopez met me at the door, her hair streaked with more gray but her smile unchanged. "Miss Emily," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You came. I told you I would," I said, hugging her tightly. "You look different." "Older," I joked. "Stronger," she corrected. Inside, the decorations were breathtaking, of course. Garlands of white roses, crystal ornaments, a Christmas tree taller than the chandelier. Everything glittered from the silverware to the guests' jewelry. I could hear laughter spilling from the main hall, my father's voice booming over the music. Mrs. Lopez led me to the grand staircase. "They're waiting in the dining room," she said softly. "Be kind, but not too kind." I smiled. "You know me too well." I paused at the top of the stairs. Below I saw them, the family tableau. Dad at the head of the table, Mom adjusting her diamond necklace, Ryan whispering to Chloe. They looked perfect. They always did. But perfection cracks easily. For a heartbeat, I considered turning back. Then I heard my father's voice carry through the room. "Well, if she even shows up, at least we'll have some entertainment." Laughter followed, sharp as glass. I exhaled slowly, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I descended. Conversations faltered. Faces turned. My mother rose, first surprise flickering, before she composed her smile. "Emily, darling, you made it." Dad leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning me from head to toe. "You look healthy," he said, which in Grant language meant you've gained weight. "Thanks, Dad." "You too." It was the Grant way insult, wrapped in a compliment impossible to fully address. Ryan grinned. "You're on time." "That's new." "Traffic was light," I said smoothly, taking my seat across from him. "And I didn't want to miss the show." The tension snapped into place, invisible but electric. My father cleared his throat. "Well, let's begin. We've got quite the guest list tonight. Some of our investors, a few old friends. Try not to embarrass yourself, Emily." "I'll do my best," I said. As the first course arrived, I caught Mrs. Lopez watching from the doorway. She gave me the smallest nod, one that said, "You have the upper hand now, don't forget it." The evening had only begun, but the stage was already set. The same table where they once decided I wasn't good enough was waiting to host my quiet revenge. And as the snow fell harder outside, I realized that Christmas was the perfect backdrop for it, because nothing glitters brighter than hypocrisy under candlelight. The dining room smelled of pine-roasted duck and expensive wine. My mother had outdone herself, everything sparkled, as if the evening were a photo shoot for Forbes Home and Family. Silver candles lined the center of the table, flickering across glass ornaments and crystal flutes filled with champagne. Every detail screamed perfection, and yet underneath the glitter I could feel it, the quiet hum of tension, the unspoken hierarchy that had ruled this family for as long as I could remember. Dad stood at the head of the table, glass raised. To family, he declared, his tone commanding, more than celebrating. To the legacy we've built, and to the future we protect. To family, the others echoed, clinking their glasses. I lifted mine too, though the word felt hollow in my mouth. Dinner began like a play in slow motion, each person playing their role. Mom, the graceful hostess; Ryan, the golden heir; Chloe, the perfect fiancé with a diamond so large it caught the candlelight like a small sun; and me, the black sheep seated at the far end, exactly where they wanted me. Mrs. Lopez moved quietly among the guests, refilling glasses. She paused behind me for a moment, her hand brushing my shoulder, a silent reassurance. I gave her the smallest smile before turning back to the table where Chloe was holding court. And of course the engagement party was just magical, she was saying. We had it at the Four Seasons, you know. The governor's wife stopped by. She said she'd never seen such a tasteful event. Mom leaned in approvingly. You really do have an eye for these things, Chloe. Dad nodded. That's the kind of initiative I like to see. Practical. Classy, Ryan smirked, unlike some people's idea of entrepreneurship. My fork froze midair. Some people, I asked mildly. He shrugged. You know what I mean. You always chase these side projects. Art, food, tech, whatever phase you were in that year. Chloe laughed softly. I think it's sweet. Everyone needs a hobby. Dad's laugh joined hers. Yes, as long as hobbies stay hobbies. Real wealth comes from tradition. From structure. Not from chasing fairy tales. The table went silent for a moment. The string quartet playing softly in the corner seemed to fill the gap between his words and my thoughts. I set down my fork, wiping my lips with my napkin. Tradition's valuable, I said evenly, but it's also how people get stuck repeating mistakes. Sometimes structure just means a prettier prison. Dad raised an eyebrow. Still quoting poetry instead of business reports, I see. Ryan chuckled. She does that when she's nervous. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my wine, letting the ruby liquid swirl. So Ryan, I said lightly, how's the family business? I read that Grant Holdings stock dipped again this quarter. The smile dropped from his face. Temporary, he said quickly. Market fluctuations. We're restructuring, Dad added sharply. The media exaggerates. We're fine. Of course, I said, feigning concern. I just hope you didn't take too many risks with derivatives this time. Those can be unpredictable. The look he gave me could have frozen the room. You wouldn't understand, he said curtly. Leave the numbers to people who actually manage real portfolios. I smiled. You'd be surprised what I manage. Mom stepped in before he could respond, her voice sweet but firm. Let's not turn dinner into a board meeting. Ryan, tell us about your honeymoon plans. He launched into a description of private villas in the Maldives, a yacht, a custom champagne partnership with some brand he couldn't even pronounce. Chloe giggled, chiming in with details. I listened, half amused, half detached. The money talk was supposed to intimidate me, to remind me where I ranked. But if they had any idea who signed the quarterly investment reports for half the brands they bragged about, their laughter would have died mid-sentence. Dessert arrived, a chocolate soufflé dusted with gold leaf. Mom insisted it had been flown in from New York that morning. Nothing but the best, she said proudly. I glanced toward Mrs. Lopez, who caught my eye again, clearly fighting a smile. Chloe leaned forward. So, Emily? She began tilting her head. What do you do now? Still, freelancing? I dabbed my lips with my napkin. Something like that. Ryan laughed. She probably runs an Etsy store for holiday candles. Dad joined in. At least candles can't bankrupt a company. I set my glass down. Not yet, I said softly. But give me time. They thought it was a joke. They laughed louder. Across the table, I noticed a guest I hadn't expected, a man in a navy suit with a polite smile and the posture of someone accustomed to high rooms. My father introduced him casually. Between courses, "This is Charles Denning, our new investment consultant. He's helping us with international holdings." Charles nodded. "Pleasure to meet you all." Our eyes met briefly. There was recognition there. He knew who I was. More importantly, he knew what I was. Aldridge, Private Wealth's senior account manager. My banker. He gave no sign of it, of course, but as he adjusted his napkin, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent understanding. I looked away, hiding a smile. Dad's voice pulled me back. "So, Emily, tell us, do you plan on getting serious?" "Settling down? Serious about what?" "About life," he said, gesturing vaguely. "A job, a man's stability. You're 31 now, aren't you? That's a dangerous age to still be figuring things out." "Dangerous," I repeated the word, rolling on my tongue. "Interesting choice." Mom gave a nervous laugh. "He just means you deserve comfort, dear." "Oh, I'm comfortable," I said. Chloe raised an eyebrow. "In New York? On a receptionist's salary?" Ryan snorted into his drink. I looked directly at her. "You'd be amazed what I can afford these days." The silence that followed was sharp and sudden. Dad broke it with another laugh, though it sounded forced. Always the dreamer. I let the conversation drift again, pretending to be distracted by the snow outside. Every word they said fed into the same illusion that I was still the failure they'd decided I was. And that illusion was my greatest weapon. When dinner ended, Mom stood clapping softly. "A toast," she announced, "to family success, past, present, and future." Glasses rose again. I lifted mine last, letting my gaze move slowly from Dad to Ryan to Chloe. "To future success," I said, "and to surprises along the way." He frowned sharply, searching my eyes for the joke. "Don't be ridiculous, Emily. You never could finish anything you started." Mrs. Lopez appeared beside me, murmuring discreetly, "Miss Emily, a matter regarding your arrangement needs your attention in the study now. Charles says to take the call." I set down my glass, feeling the ripple of anticipation rise inside me. "Excuse me," I said, pushing back my chair. "It seems business doesn't take holidays." And as I walked toward the study, every step echoed with the promise of what was coming next. The study smelled like leather oak and old ambition. My father's trophies lined the shelves, framed awards, stock certificates, family photos that didn't include me. I closed the door behind me, the muffled laughter from the dining room fading into silence. The lamp on the desk cast a pool of amber light over the polished surface where I used to sneak in as a child to read business magazines I wasn't supposed to touch. The phone on the mahogany desk blinked with a single-line incoming call, "Aldridge Private Wealth." I picked it up. "This is Emily Grant." "Good evening, Ms. Grant," said the voice on the other end, steady, precise, unmistakably professional. "This is Andrew Collins from Aldridge. I hope I'm not interrupting your holiday." "Not at all," I said, glancing at the door. "What's the update?" He hesitated just long enough for me to know he understood where I was. "Your new accounts have been finalized," he said carefully. "Total assets now verified at $30 billion. We've transferred your holdings under the Morningstar Global Fund as requested." I smiled, the kind that no one else could see. "Perfect timing." Andrew paused again as if debating whether to continue. "Also, I was informed that Charles Denning, our senior consultant, is attending your family dinner tonight. Shall I assume that was intentional?" My eyes flicked toward the hallway where I could hear faint clinking and laughter. "Let's just say the universe has a sense of humor." He gave a small laugh. "Understood. He'll maintain discretion." I have no doubt. We exchanged a few final formalities before I ended the call. The moment the line went dead, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. 30 billion. The number hung in the air like a quiet storm. I walked to the window overlooking the snowy courtyard. The pine trees glistened beneath strings of white lights. Somewhere out there, the night hummed with peace, but inside me everything felt sharp and electric. The door creaked open. Mrs. Lopez stepped in, closing it gently behind her. "Was that really your banker?" she whispered. "Yes." Her eyes widened. "And it's true you're not poor," I said softly. She smiled, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I always knew you'd rise, Miss Emily. You were never like them." "Don't cry, Maria," I said, calling her by her first name for the first time in years. "You'll ruin your mascara." She chuckled, wiping her eyes. "Your father asked me to fetch you. Dessert's being served." I nodded. "Tell him I'll be right there." When she left, I turned back to the mirror above the desk. My reflection stared back, calm, deliberate, utterly in control. For years I'd imagined what this moment would feel like. It wasn't rage anymore. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, colder. Justice with silk gloves. I picked up my phones again and opened the Aldridge app. The balance glowed on the screen. Proof. I traced the number with my thumb, then locked the screen and slipped the phone into my clutch. The weight of the moment felt immense, but I carried it lightly. I walked toward the door. The hallway echoed under my heels, a rhythm I controlled now. When I stepped back into the dining room, conversations faltered for a split second. My father looked up from his chair, glass in hand. "All settled?" he asked. "All settled," I said, taking my seat again. Ryan leaned forward, smirking. "So who was calling on Christmas Eve?" "Your landlord." "Something better?" I said lightly. "A matter of liquidity." Chloe giggled, resting her hand on Ryan's arm. "Oh, let her be. Maybe it was her boyfriend, probably a waiter at one of those little city cafes." I smiled at her sweetly. "Actually, it was my banker." Her laughter faltered. "Your banker?" "Mm-hmm." I took a sip of wine. "He wanted to confirm a transfer. Year-end housekeeping." Dad chuckled. "Housekeeping. That's one word for it. You mean the overdraft protection, right?" Ryan joined in. "You must be their smallest account." I set my glass down the stem, making the faintest click against the table. "Actually," I said, glancing toward Charles Denning, "I believe one of Aldridge's senior consultants here tonight can confirm otherwise." Charles froze mid-sip. Slowly, every head at the table turned toward him. He cleared his throat, eyes darting between my father and me. Well, yes. I work with Aldridge." Dad frowned. "You're her banker," Charles smiled nervously. "I can't discuss client matters, of course." Confidentiality. My mother's expression shifted, confusion warring with curiosity. "Emily, what are you talking about?" I leaned back, letting the pause stretch the silence, growing taut like a wire. "Just business," I said. "Apparently I'm one of their larger clients now." Ryan laughed too loud. "I client at Aldridge. Please. They handle billionaires." The room went still. I didn't blink. "I know." For a long moment, no one moved. Then my father barked a laugh, brittle and forced. "All right, enough of the jokes. You've made your point." But I didn't look away. "No jokes tonight, Dad." The air changed. Even the faint background music seemed to fade. Chloe's hand slipped from Ryan's arm. My mother's lips parted, a soft gasp escaping. Dad's voice hardened. "What are you saying?" I folded my hands on the table, calm, deliberate. "I'm saying that when I left this family, you told me I'd never succeed without your name. You told me I'd end up broke. Tonight my banker called to confirm that my accounts total $30 billion. The words dropped like stones into a still pond. The silence that followed was total. Dad's face went pale. Ryan's jaw slackened. Chloe's wineglass tilted dangerously before she caught it. Mom's hand trembled where it rested on the tablecloth. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "It's true," he said finally. "Ms. Grant is one of our largest clients globally." He didn't look at Dad or Ryan. He looked only at me, a silent professional salute across the ruined table. The sound of Ryan's glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor cut through the stillness. Wine spread across the white linen like spilled blood. No one spoke. I leaned back, my smile small but steady. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly. Dad stood slowly, his voice shaking between disbelief and anger. You expect me to believe this 30 billion, from what fairy dust? From work, I said. From vision. From the same drive you said I didn't have. Mom whispered Emily, but the rest of her sentence died in her throat. Ryan pushed back his chair. This is ridiculous. You're making this up. Charles straightened his tie, eyes still down. She isn't. The only sound left in the room was the soft crackle of the fireplace. I rose, smoothing the fabric of my black dress. Dinner's been lovely, I said. Thank you for the invitation. Dad opened his mouth to speak, but I was already walking toward the door. Every step was measured quiet and final. Behind me, the empire that had once banished me sat frozen in shock. Mrs. Lopez stood by the hallway, eyes shining. Miss Emily, she whispered as I passed. I smiled at her. It's just Emily now. And with that, I left them stunned silent and staring at the space where the failure they'd mocked used to sit. The air outside the dining room felt colder than the snow drifting beyond the windows. I walked down the long marble hallway toward the foyer, the sound of my heels echoing off the walls like the punctuation to a sentence none of them had expected to hear. My hand trembled only slightly as I reached for my coat from the rack, adrenaline, not nerves. Behind me, muffled voices began to rise, a confused blur of anger, disbelief, and fear. Emily. My father's voice bellowed from the dining room. I didn't stop. Don't you walk away from this conversation. I turned slowly, deliberately. He stood framed in the doorway, red-faced, his pride stripped bare. The rest of the family hovered behind him, Ryan pale and stiff. Mom wringing her hands. Chloe looking like she wanted to vanish into her sequins. I think the conversation's over, I said quietly. Dad's jaw tightened. You don't show up here after 5 years and humiliate us with some ridiculous story about money. 30 billion. Do you expect me to believe that I didn't ask you to believe it? I replied. I simply stated a fact. Ryan stormed forward. You're lying. There's no way. You probably paid that banker to say it. Charles Denning appeared behind them, his voice composed but strained. Actually, Mr. Grant, I assure you she isn't lying. Aldridge doesn't falsify financial statements. Ms. Grant is indeed one of our top-tier clients. My father spun on him. And you brought this up tonight. At my table? Charles's professionalism cracked for the first time. Sir, I had no idea this was your daughter. I was invited here as a consultant. I found out only moments ago. The words seemed to hang there, the truth too large for the room to contain. Mom finally spoke, her voice thin and trembling. Emily, why didn't you tell us all this time I met her eyes? Because I wanted to see how you'd treat me if you thought I was still broke. A silence fell so heavy I could almost hear the candles flicker behind them. Dad opened his mouth, but I cut him off. Do you remember what you said 5 years ago? You dismissed me because you thought failure was reserved only for the weak. You wanted me to break. His face hardened. That was business. No, I said, stepping closer. That was cruelty. You humiliated me in front of your board because you thought breaking me would make you feel powerful. You didn't want a daughter, you wanted another reflection of yourself. Ryan's voice cracked through the silence. You could have told us. You could have. What? I interrupted. Give you a piece of it. Let you manage my portfolio like you mismanaged your own. You're still trying to save the company, aren't you? You're desperate for an investor. His face flushed crimson. How did you... I read the quarterly reports, I said. Your stock's in freefall. Your board's threatening to remove you. The same people who once applauded you for firing me are now planning your exit. Dad's breath hitched, the color draining from his cheeks. You think you can just walk in here, and I already have. I turned ready to leave again, but my mother stepped forward, her voice trembling. Please, she said softly. Don't leave like this. She reached out, her fingers trembling, trying to grasp my arm. We were wrong, she whispered. All of us. We didn't know what you were doing. We thought... Her voice broke. We thought you'd failed. I exhaled slowly. You didn't care if I failed. You cared that I embarrassed you. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't let them move me. Years of silence couldn't be erased by one apology wrapped in fear. Chloe cleared her throat, her voice shaky. Emily, you have to admit, it's shocking. Nobody just becomes a billionaire out of nowhere. People do, I said, when they're not busy hosting cocktail parties about legacies. Ryan glared at me. You always thought you were better than us. No, I said. I just stopped letting you convince me I was worse. The room fell silent again. For once my father had nothing to say. He stood there, shoulders squared, but gaze unfocused like a man watching the world he built crumble grain by grain. Emily, he said finally. His tone measured but hollow. If what you say is true, then you should understand what it means to protect a business, to protect a family. You can't hold on to resentment forever. I'm not resentful, I said. I'm realistic. And I know the difference between family and people who only love you when you're useful. He flinched as if I'd struck him. I turned back toward the door, my coat draped over my arm. Enjoy your Christmas, I said. Consider this my final appearance in your little production. Wait, Mom called out, her voice breaking. Please, Emily, we want to make things right. I paused my hand on the doorknob. Do you? Yes, she said. We can start over. You're still our daughter. The word still caught me like a shard of glass. You don't get to rediscover your daughter only when she's rich. Ryan muttered something under his breath, probably another insult, but I didn't bother to listen. I pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway, the warmth of the house fading behind me. Mrs. Lopez was waiting by the entrance, her eyes full of quiet pride. You did what you needed to do, she said. I did, I said softly. And now it's done. She hesitated, then pressed something into my hand, a small silver cross on a thin chain. You left this here when you moved out, she said. I kept it safe. Thought you might need it again someday. I closed my fingers around it. Thank you. I slipped the silver cross into my pocket, the metal already warm against my palm. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air hit me like a clean breath. Snowflakes landed on my coat, melting instantly. The world outside the mansion was still endless white under the moonlight. I looked back once through the frosted window. I could see my family frozen at the table, stunned and wordless, a portrait of power undone. My phone buzzed again, another message from Andrew Collins. Confirmed transfer completed. Happy holidays, Ms. Grant. I smiled. Happy holidays, I whispered to myself. When I reached my car, I paused before opening the door, glancing once more at the glowing windows behind me. For years, that house had defined me, a prison built of expectation and condescension. Now it was just another building full of people who finally saw me clearly, maybe for the first time in their lives. I rolled down the window slightly, letting the cold air sting my face. It felt like freedom. And as I left the estate for the last time, one truth settled deep in my chest. I was not their failure, and I was not their solution. They had called me poor. Now they could call me something else untouchable. When I woke the next morning, Aspen was buried in silence. The storm had thickened overnight, blanketing everything in white, so pure it almost looked staged. The sun hadn't yet risen high enough to reach the peaks, and the light coming through my hotel window was a pale gray blue. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, letting the memories of last night replay in fragments. The wine, the shock, the sound of Ryan's glass shattering my father's disbelief. For the first time in years, I felt empty in a good way. Like the space inside me that had once been filled with anger and old wounds was finally clean. It wasn't joy, not exactly. More like the quiet steadiness that comes after a storm has passed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. One unread message from an unknown number. Emily, this is Charles Denning. I wanted to apologize for what happened last night. Your composure was exceptional. Regarding Aldridge, the senior management is already asking about a strategic partnership if you're open to a meeting after the holidays. I smiled faintly. Grace, that wasn't what last night had felt like to me. It had felt like justice wearing silk gloves. Still, I typed back, thank you, Charles. Tell Aldridge I'll reach out after the new year. And thank you for your discretion. The next message came seconds later from Mom. Please call me. I stared at the words for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could imagine her voice, already fragile, measured, still trying to control the narrative. But something in the message felt different. Less commanding. More human. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the snow drift lazily across the parking lot. Eventually, I sighed and called. She answered on the first ring. "Emily, yes." Her voice trembled slightly. "Are you still in Aspen for now?" I wanted to say, "I'm sorry. For everything." There was silence on my end. I could hear the faint clinking of silverware in the background, the soft murmur of servants cleaning up the wreckage of last night's dinner. "I know I wasn't a good mother to you," she continued. "I thought I was doing what was best, teaching you the way things worked, but I see now that I was just repeating the mistakes my parents made with me." Her honesty startled me. It wasn't the polished, controlled version of her I'd grown up with. This was the woman behind the performance. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Say you'll come by before you leave," she said quickly. "Just for coffee. No crowd, no pretenses. Just us." I hesitated. "And Dad?" "He's not himself today," she said carefully. "He's been in his study all morning." Of course he had. Pride doesn't break easily. It cracks, then hides. "All right," I said finally. "I'll stop by at noon." When I arrived, the mansion looked almost peaceful under the blanket of snow. The drive had been plowed, the walkway lined with lanterns. Mrs. Lopez met me at the door, her smile a quiet mix of pride and concern. "Your mother's waiting in the conservatory," she whispered. "Your father hasn't spoken a word since you left." The conservatory smelled like citrus and pine. My mother sat near the window in a cream sweater, her makeup softer than usual. A pot of coffee steamed between us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "You look tired," she said gently. "I slept fine." "Better than your father, then," she murmured, pouring 2 cups. "He stayed up until dawn. I think he's trying to convince himself it's all a misunderstanding." "That sounds like him," I said. We sipped our coffee in silence for a while, the snow outside glowing brighter as the sun broke through. Finally she spoke. "You built something extraordinary, Emily. I don't pretend to understand all of it, but I saw the articles this morning. Forbes, Bloomberg, Business Insider. Your name is everywhere." I raised an eyebrow. "You read Forbes now?" She smiled weakly. I skimmed it this time. We both laughed, though it felt fragile. Then her expression sobered. "I wish we'd seen you for who you were sooner." "You saw me," I said quietly. "You just didn't like what you saw." She didn't deny it. Maybe we were afraid. You always reminded your father of what he couldn't control, and that frightened him more than he'd ever admit. I studied her face, the fine lines near her eyes, the way she looked smaller, somehow softer. For the first time, I felt a flicker of empathy. "You could have stopped him." "I tried," she whispered. "You think I didn't? But your father's world runs on dominance, not reason." Her words settled between us, heavy but true. We sat in silence again until Mrs. Lopez appeared at the door, her expression hesitant. "Mr. Grant wants to see Miss Emily. He's in his study." Mom glanced at me. "You don't have to." "I know," I said, "but I think I should." The study door was half open. My father sat behind his desk, the same one I'd stood in front of the day he'd fired me. He looked smaller now, the proud lines of his posture, replaced by something heavier, defeat maybe, or shame. He didn't look up when I entered. "I suppose you've come to enjoy the view from the high ground," he said. I closed the door behind me. "I didn't come to gloat." He exhaled, his voice rough. "Then why are you here?" "Because you're still my father," I said simply. That made him look up. His eyes were red, tired, but still sharp. "You humiliated me last night." "No," I said softly. "You humiliated yourself. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening." He flinched at that. For a moment, he looked like he might yell again, but instead his shoulders slumped. "You sound like your mother," he muttered. "I'll take that as a compliment." He gave a low, humorless laugh. "You think you're better than me now?" "I don't think I'm better," I said. "I think I'm free." That shut him up. I stepped closer, resting my hand on the edge of his desk. "You taught me that money was the ultimate power." But the true power is the ability to walk away from that money, and you don't have it. I do. That is the lesson I learned the hard way. He said nothing. Your company's failing, I continued quietly. I could help you if I wanted to, but I won't. Not because I want to see you lose, but because you need to understand what it's like to rebuild from the ground up, the way I did. And when you realize you can't, I might be here to watch the bidding war. He stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once, slowly, painfully. Maybe you're right. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one he'd ever given. When I walked back through the conservatory, my mother stood waiting. How did it go? Better than I expected, I said. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky had cleared into the kind of blue that only comes after a storm, cold, sharp, breathtaking. I pulled my coat tighter and smiled faintly. I had walked into that house once as a daughter, desperate for approval. Now I was leaving it as a woman whose greatest asset was not $30 billion, but the freedom to turn her back on the house that had once defined her. 3 days after Christmas, my phone buzzed nonstop. News of my family dinner revelation had somehow leaked into the world beyond Aspen. I suspected someone from the guest list, maybe one of my father's investors, maybe even Chloe, who had the discretion of a goldfish with Wi-Fi. Either way, the story had spread like wildfire. Disowned daughter turned billionaire. Outsmarts family at Christmas dinner. I should have been angry, but I wasn't. If anything, I was amused. The version of events circulating online was almost cinematic, embellished, dramatized, completely lacking nuance. But for once, I didn't need to correct the narrative. Let the tabloids have their story. I had mine. Still the calls came, journalists, network producers, old acquaintances, who suddenly remembered my number. I ignored them all until my assistant at Morningstar, Clara, called from New York. You're trending on every major platform, she said, breathless. Hashiga billionaire daughter has 50 million views. Lovely, I said dryly. Just what I wanted for the holidays. Clara laughed nervously. There's also talk that Grant Holdings' board might be looking for a bailout investor. Some are saying they might approach you. I went silent. The irony was almost too perfect. That night, as snow continued to fall outside my Aspen hotel, I opened my laptop and skimmed through financial reports. She was right. Grant Holdings was hemorrhaging cash. Stock down 30% since October. Internal documents hinted at layoffs. It was in every sense a crumbling empire. And my father was still clinging to the wheel. I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of Cabernet. The thought lingered. Should I save them? I could easily. One wire transfer and the company would stabilize. But at what cost? To my pride, my peace. The next morning, I got my answer when Ryan showed up. He arrived unannounced, wearing a tailored coat and an expression that tried to balance arrogance with desperation. I saw the exhaustion behind his eyes before he even spoke. Nice place, he said, glancing around my suite. Bigger than I expected. Still smaller than your ego, I replied, finally looking up. He gave a hollow laugh. You've always been good at insults. And you've always had bad timing. What do you want? He sighed, rubbing his temples. Dad doesn't know I'm here. But things are bad, Emily. The company's weeks away from losing major contracts. Investors are spooked. The board is restless. I finally looked at him. So you came here to what, beg? His nostrils flared. To make an offer. I leaned back amused. An offer. Go on. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. A proposal. You invest in Grant Holdings. In exchange, we give you a controlling share. You'd effectively become CEO. I blinked. You're asking me to take over the family company? He hesitated. To save it. The irony was so sharp I could almost taste it. The same company that fired me in front of half of Denver's financial elite, the same one Dad said I wasn't good enough to represent. Ryan's jaw tightened. We made mistakes. He made mistakes. But you have to understand this isn't just about business. Hundreds of employees depend on us. I stood and walked to the window, the snow outside dazzlingly bright. And suddenly you care about people below your pay grade. He bristled. You think you're better than us now? I turned. No, I just think differently. That's why I'm standing here, and you're here asking for help. For a moment the mask slipped and I saw the boy he used to be, the one who'd sneak me cookies during Dad's lectures, who once told me I was the only person in the family who really listened. Then it was gone, replaced by calculation. If you don't help us, Grant Holdings collapses, he said flatly. Our name goes down in ruins. Our name, I echoed. You mean Dad's name? The one he used like a weapon? He looked away. He's still our father. Yes, I said softly. But he's not my responsibility anymore. He took a breath, frustration radiating off him. At least think about it. You can turn this into a legacy, one that's yours, not his. I studied him for a moment. You're not wrong, I admitted. But legacy means nothing without integrity. Tell me, Ryan, if I buy this company, who do you think I'll keep? He blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I said, stepping closer. Do you think I'd keep the same board that laughed when I was fired? The same executives who cheered when Dad called me unfit for leadership? I read the filings. Your debt-to-equity ratio is upside down and your covenants are shot. Your board is moving to activate Clause 2.1 involuntary termination. He went still. I smiled faintly. No. If I take over, I rebuild it from the ground up. And I start by cleaning the house. He swallowed hard. So that's a yes? That's a maybe, I said. I'll think about it. But not for you, for the people your father never saw. Ryan nodded, his pride struggling to stay intact. Fine, I'll tell him. He turned to leave but stopped at the door. You know, he said quietly, Dad's been reading articles about you all week. He won't admit it, but he's proud. I looked at him steadily. Pride means nothing without respect. After he left, I sat back down and stared at the folder. A proposal. Control, power. The old Emily would have jumped at the chance to prove herself, to show them she could fix what they'd broken. But the woman I'd become knew better. Sometimes power doesn't come from taking over what once hurt you, it comes from walking away and watching it fall without needing to lift a hand. Still, curiosity won out. I opened the folder. Inside were financial statements, graphs, and a single handwritten note in my father's familiar scrawl. I know I do not deserve this. If you help do it for the name we built. Do not mistake control for strength. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger when I saw his handwriting. Just exhaustion. Maybe he finally understood what I'd been trying to show him all along, that family built on control isn't family at all. I closed the folder and poured another glass of wine. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the first light of dusk glowed soft and gold over the mountains. Tomorrow I'd call my lawyer and Alex. We wouldn't stage a takeover. We would execute a surgical acquisition, a quiet purchase of distressed assets under the Morningstar umbrella. They didn't need to know I'd saved them. They just needed to learn what it felt like to be saved by someone they once called worthless. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I allowed myself one last thought before letting it all go. Revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. And in that sense, I was already winning. The morning the buyout was finalized, New York was still half asleep under a gray winter sky. My office sat on the 42nd floor of the Morningstar Tower, glass walls, opening onto a skyline that had become my new kind of cathedral, cold, glittering alive. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, as Clara read the final update from my legal team. It's done, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Alex confirmed the transfer minutes later. Grant Holdings is officially under Morningstar control. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the city instead, the way light crawled up the buildings, reflecting in waves across the river. The world kept moving, indifferent to the fact that one empire had just fallen and another had quietly taken its place. Clara hesitated. Do you want me to inform the press? No, I said. Not yet. She blinked. You don't want the announcement? I shook my head. Some victories don't need fireworks. She nodded, understanding me the way she always did, and slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with the silence. I thought about my father, about Ryan, about that night in Aspen when the word billionaire had broken something open in all of us. It would be so easy to call them now, to let the news slip into conversation like an afterthought. By the way, I own the company you tried to destroy me in. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and opened my laptop. There was still work to do, contracts to review, departments to restructure, lives to consider. Because this wasn't just revenge anymore. This was rebuilding. At 11 sharp, I called the new executive team into the boardroom. They were a mix of old and new people who'd stayed loyal to Grant Holdings through its collapse, and the sharp, hungry minds I'd recruited from Morningstar. Let's be clear, I began standing at the head of the table. This is not a merger. This is a reinvention. The Grant name will remain, but it won't stand for power or status anymore. It'll stand for opportunity. There were nods around the room. Some skeptical, some inspired. We're converting 30% of operations into the Grant Foundation, I continued. Our focus will shift toward funding small business grants, women-led startups, and renewable energy ventures. Profit will still matter, but so will purpose. A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. One man, a senior analyst who'd been with my father for decades, cleared his throat. That's ambitious. Some might say radical. Good, I said simply. If it doesn't scare you, it's not worth doing. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the room had changed. People were smiling again. There was movement, hope, things my father's boardroom had never known. That night, long after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind in my office. The city below glowed like an electric heartbeat pulsing with millions of stories I would never know. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice before he answered. Emily, hi, Dad. He exhaled slowly, as if the sound of my voice had been both expected and dreaded. I wondered when you'd call. I wasn't sure I would. I suppose you got what you wanted. Control. No, I said. The time for winning is over, Dad. I did it because your failures shouldn't punish those who relied on you. He let out a rough laugh. Always the moral one. Someone had to be. Another long pause. Then softly, your mother's been asking about you. I know. She called last week, and Ryan, he's figuring things out, I said carefully. He came to me for help. My father snorted. Of course he did. Always looking for a way out. Maybe he's finally learning accountability, I said. We all had to. He didn't argue. Just sighed. You sound different. I am. There was something fragile in his voice when he spoke again. I never wanted it to be this way, Emily. You and I are on opposite sides. We were never on opposite sides, I said. You just never looked over to see where I was standing. He said nothing, but I could tell he understood. When the call ended, I sat there in the dark for a long time watching the city. Somewhere out there, my father was facing the consequences of his own design. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or triumph. Just peace. The next morning, my name hit the headlines again, this time for the buyout. Morningstar acquires Grant Holdings, a daughter's redemption. The photo beneath it showed me walking out of my office, chin-high expression, unreadable. Clara burst into the room, around 8 tablet in hand. They're calling you the silent billionaire. I laughed. That's new. It's trending, she said. People love the story. The woman who rebuilt her family's empire without destroying it. I smiled faintly. Maybe that's the story they need right now. We spent the rest of the day fielding calls, signing statements, and prepping for interviews I would later decline. By the time evening fell, my head was pounding. I turned off my phone, grabbed my coat, and slipped out into the freezing air. Outside, the city was alive, honking cars, street vendors closing up shop, steam rising from the grates. I walked aimlessly past the Rockefeller tree, still half lit, past people taking pictures of themselves under twinkling lights. I ended up in Central Park near the frozen pond. The quiet there was a kind I hadn't known in years. A group of kids were skating, their laughter echoing through the cold. I sat on a bench watching them, thinking about how strange it was to have everything and still crave simplicity. Maybe that was what success really was. Not the headlines, not the money, but the freedom to sit in silence without feeling like you had to prove something. My phone buzzed again. A text from Ryan. "Dad's not doing great. Could you come by this weekend? He won't ask, but he needs you." I read it twice before replying. "I'll be there." It wasn't a weakness. It was a choice. A decision to trade the sharp edge of revenge for the difficult, messy burden of forgiveness. When I looked up, snow had started to fall again, light, almost invisible. I stood tucking my hands into my pockets and smiled to myself. Revenge had burned itself out. What remained was something quieter, deeper. It wasn't about turning tables anymore. It was about learning to leave them behind. By the time the television lights hit my face, I wasn't nervous anymore. Not the way I had been 5 years ago, standing in front of a boardroom full of men waiting for me to fail. This was different. This time, the power was mine. The studio was colder than I expected, spotlights blazing, but the air conditioning turned high to keep makeup from melting under the heat. The producer gave me the countdown, in 3, 2, 1, and then the red light blinked on. "Good evening, everyone," the anchor began. "Tonight on the Money Hour, we have a very special guest, Emily Grant, the CEO and founder of Morningstar Capital, the visionary behind one of the fastest-growing private investment firms in America. Emily, thank you for joining us." "Thank you for having me," I said, my voice calm, measured. "You've been in the headlines quite a bit lately," she continued. "From your historic acquisition of Grant Holdings, your family's former company, to your new philanthropic initiative, the Grant Foundation. How does it feel to be at the center of it all?" I smiled slightly. "Surreal mostly, but also inevitable." She tilted her head. "Inevitable." "Yes," I said. "Because the moment they decided I was disposable, they ceded control over my future. What followed was simply logical and therefore inevitable." The producer behind the glass smiled. The anchor leaned forward, sensing a moment. "You mentioned once that your family's disapproval was your greatest motivator. Do you still feel that way?" I paused, letting the silence breathe before answering. "No. They weren't my motivator. They were my mirror. They showed me what I didn't want to become." The anchor's eyes flickered with surprise. "That's powerful. Can I ask, have you spoken to them since the acquisition?" "Yes," I said quietly. "And it wasn't about business." She nodded, clearly wanting to press, but too professional to pry. "Fair enough. Let's talk about Morningstar. You've managed to grow it into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in less than 5 years. What's your secret?" "There isn't one," I said. "Just consistency, humility, and the courage to start over when everyone thinks you've failed." We talked for 20 minutes about business, about leadership, about the future. And then just before the segment ended, she asked the question I knew was coming. "What would you say to that younger version of yourself?" she asked softly. The one who was fired by her own family and told she'd never make it. I looked straight into the camera. "I'd tell her that being underestimated is the best gift anyone can give you, because when no one believes in you, you're free to believe in yourself without limits." When the red light finally went off, the studio fell quiet, except for the shuffling of papers. The anchor reached over and squeezed my hand. "That was beautiful," she said. "Raw. Real." "Thank you," I said, meaning it. Backstage, my assistant Clara was waiting with her tablet. "We're already trending," she said breathlessly. "That last line, people are quoting it everywhere." I laughed. Let's hope they remember the part about consistency, too. But beneath the humor, I felt something shift. The interview hadn't just been a broadcast, it was a declaration, a closing of a chapter that had defined too much of my life. As we left the building, the night air hit me like a wave of clarity. Manhattan glittered in the distance, alive and indifferent. Paparazzi lights flashed briefly, but I didn't stop. I'd spent too long living under other people's lenses. When I got home, I found an envelope waiting on my kitchen counter, delivered by hand. No name. Just the faint scent of cedar and tobacco. The kind of cologne my father used to wear. Inside was a handwritten note. Emily, I watched the interview. You were magnificent. I don't say that lightly. You made me proud tonight, truly proud. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but if you have the time, your mother and I would like to see you. Sunday dinner. No agendas. No business. Just family. I hope one day you can forgive me. I never truly saw you until now. Dad. I read it 3 times, each word heavier than the last. My father had never written me a letter before. He dictated memos, barked orders, made pronouncements, but never written. Sunday dinner. The same setting where it had all begun. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the skyline through my window. For years I had dreamed of that kind of recognition, of hearing him say he was proud. Now that I had it, it felt different, smaller, like a memory I'd already outgrown. Still, something in me softened. Maybe it was time. Maybe the story isn't over yet. The next day, Morningstar's communications team called to confirm the interview's success. Forbes wants a follow-up, Clara said. They're calling you the most influential woman in American finance. I smiled faintly. Let them call me whatever they want. I know who I am. That afternoon, I met with the advisory board for the Grant Foundation. The conference room buzzed with energy as we outlined our next project, a nationwide mentorship program for women in business. Imagine, I said, if every woman who's ever been told she's not enough could hear from someone who's been there, someone who made it anyway. The room fell silent for a moment, then broke into applause. When the meeting ended, Clara pulled me aside. You know, Emily, she said quietly, you're changing more than just companies now. You're changing people. Her words lingered with me long after I went home. That night I took a long walk along the Hudson. The water shimmered under the city lights, the sound of distant laughter echoing across the pier. For the first time I felt completely at peace, not triumphant, not vindicated, just still. My phone buzzed a message from my brother. Mom's been planning dinner all week. It's hard for Dad, but he needs this. And honestly, I do too. We'll be waiting. I smiled. Tell them I'll be there. When I returned home, I found myself glancing again at my father's note. His handwriting looked fragile, uncertain, like he'd been afraid I wouldn't read it. For years I'd believed that power came from wealth, from winning, from proving people wrong. But standing there alone in my quiet apartment, I realized something else entirely. Real power was peace. It was the quiet certainty that the girl who was fired had finally become the woman who was free. It was the ability to choose forgiveness without surrendering your dignity, to walk back into the room where you once broke and know that this time you don't need to prove anything at all. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. When I pulled up to my parents' house that Sunday evening, the world was dipped in twilight. The last streaks of sun painted the snow in gold and rose, and for a moment the mansion looked almost kind. I hadn't been here since Christmas, the night everything changed. The same stone steps, the same grand doors. But the air was different now, calmer. Mrs. Lopez opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up with a warmth that almost undid me. Ms. Emily, she said, her voice trembling. It's so good to see you again. It's good to be back, I said softly. Though I admit this feels strange. She smiled knowingly. Good strange, I hope. I handed her my coat, the scent of cinnamon and roasted herbs wafting from the kitchen. Your mother's been fussing since morning, she whispered conspiratorially. And your father? Well, he's been quiet. Nervous, maybe. Nervous, I said with a faint laugh. Now that's new. When I walked into the dining room, I almost didn't recognize it. The table, once a battlefield of tension and ego, was set simply, a linen runner, crystal glasses, candles flickering low. My mother stood near the fireplace wearing a soft navy dress instead of her usual armor of couture. My father was at the head of the table, posture straighter than his years, allowed a hint of uncertainty flickering across his face. Emily, he said. Not coldly, not formally. Just my name. Dad, I replied, nodding. My mother stepped forward and kissed my cheek, her hand lingering on my arm. You look wonderful. So do you. For a moment it felt almost normal, like time had folded and we were just a family again. But beneath it all was a current neither of us could ignore, the awareness of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Dinner began quietly. Ryan arrived late as always. His fiancée, a warm, grounded woman named Lila, by his side. He and Chloe had ended things months ago quietly after the fallout from that Christmas. She greeted me with an ease that diffused the tension instantly. Finally, the famous sister, she said, smiling. I've heard about you nonstop. All lies, I hope? I replied, earning a laugh from her and even a reluctant grin from Ryan. We sat, and for a while, conversation drifted easily. My mother asked about the foundation's programs. Ryan mentioned a new startup he was advising. The clinking of silverware filled the pauses that once would have been filled with judgment. It wasn't until after the main course, a roasted lamb with rosemary, that my father finally spoke in earnest. I saw your interview, he said quietly. The one on the Money Hour. I set down my glass. I figured you might have. You were... He hesitated, searching for the right word. Extraordinary. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. He took a sip of his wine, then continued. I won't pretend it was easy to watch. To see what you've become without me. But I've been thinking a lot about something you said, that power isn't control, it's freedom. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally giving way. My mother reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. We made mistakes, she said softly. Both of us. We raised you to value strength but not vulnerability. And I see now how unfair that was. Mom. I started, but she held up a hand. No, let me finish, she said. You didn't owe us your obedience, Emily. You owed yourself your life. And you chose it. That's brave. The words hit harder than I expected. All the resentment, all the bitterness that had once burned like acid, it didn't feel sharp anymore. Just distant. Like a shadow finally fading with the dusk. Ryan leaned back, watching us. You know, he said, Dad's been different these past few weeks. Calmer. He's even been helping me with my new firm. The humbling was painful, but it was necessary. My father gave a small, almost sheepish smile. When you lose everything, you start realizing how little you needed most of it. And how much you took for granted, my mother added, glancing toward me. I laughed softly. Well, at least we're learning. We talked for hours. About business, about childhood, about everything we'd once been too proud to say out loud. My father shared stories from his early years, failures I'd never heard about, fears he'd never admitted. My mother told me about the first time she'd met him, how she'd mistaken his arrogance for confidence. Even Ryan confessed how terrified he'd been watching the company collapse, knowing he'd have to face the truth about who we'd all become. It was strange healing, but strange. Like rediscovering an old song you'd once loved, but forgotten the words to. When dessert came, my mother excused herself and returned with a small box. She handed it to me with both hands, her voice trembling. This belonged to your grandmother, she said. She wanted you to have it when you were ready. Inside was a locket, simple gold worn smooth by years of touch. My grandmother, the only other Grant woman who had dared to pursue her own career, always knew I was different. Inside 2 pictures, my grandmother as a young woman and me at 5 years old, grinning with ice cream on my chin. I thought you'd lost this, I whispered. I kept it, my mother said. Even when things were difficult. I knew one day we'd find our way back. I closed the locket and held it tight. Thank you, I said, my voice breaking. My father cleared his throat. You've done more for this family than you realize, Emily. You gave us a second chance. No, I said quietly. You gave yourselves one. I just stopped standing in the way of it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan lifted his glass. To second chances. To grow, my mother added. My father looked at me, eyes glinting in the candlelight. To my daughter, he said simply, the best of us. I didn't cry. Not then. I just raised my glass and met his eyes. to the lessons that took us too long to learn. We drank, and for the first time in years, laughter filled the room. Not the brittle kind meant to impress or deflect, but the real kind, the sound of release. Later, when I stepped outside, the air was cold and clear. The night sky glittered above me, the snow reflecting the faint glow of the house. Behind me, I could still hear their voices, soft, warm, alive. Mrs. Lopez came to see me, off her eyes shining. "They're proud of you, you know." "I know," I said. "And for once, that's enough." As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind me. It no longer felt like the place that defined me. It was just part of the story now, a beginning, not an anchor. The city lights rose ahead of me, boson and endless. I was walking with it finally, peacefully. The past was not a weight dragging me down. It was the foundation I now stood upon. I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after that dinner, I woke up before dawn, the soft light from the city barely brushing the skyline. For once there was no rush, no meeting, no calendar alert pulling me forward. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat by the window of my penthouse, watching the sky shift from black to pale gold. Peace feels strange when you've lived most of your life chasing storms. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore, it felt earned. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email from Forbes with the subject line, "The Next Chapter." Emily Grant's vision for the future. Attached was a draft of their upcoming feature about Morningstar and the Grant Foundation. The headline made me laugh softly. 5 years ago, being on Forbes had been the dream. Now it was just part of the story. The article quoted something I'd said in my last interview: "Power is not control. It's the ability to build without fear." I sipped my coffee, reading those words again. I meant them then, but this morning they felt truer than ever. A notification popped up: Ryan. Morning flight to D.C. The board approved the education grants. Mom sends her love. Dad's actually smiling again. I smiled back at the message. Small miracles. Before I could reply, another email came in from Clara. "We finalized the partnership with the Global Women's Initiative. Congratulations, Ms. Grant. They want you to deliver the keynote at their summit next month." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the awakening city. It was strange how quickly your life could transform from survival to legacy. Later that morning, I walked into Morningstar's headquarters. The office buzzed with life, new faces, new energy. A young intern held the elevator door for me, his expression wide-eyed. "Good morning, Ms. Grant," he said. "Morning," I replied, smiling. "How's your first week going?" "Unbelievable," he said. "I didn't think people like you existed." "People like me?" I raised an eyebrow. He blushed. "I mean, people who make it without losing their soul." I laughed softly. "We exist. We just take the long road." When I reached my floor, Clara was waiting by my office with her tablet. "You have an 11 a.m. with the design team, and the foundation's new director wants a few minutes to brief you." "Push the design team," I said. "Let's meet the director first." A few minutes later, the door opened, and a young woman walked in, tall, confident eyes, bright with determination. I recognized her instantly. "Zoe," I said, standing. She grinned. "You remember me. How could I forget? You were one of our first scholarship students." And now she said, still beaming, "I'm running your foundation." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The weight of it hit me, the full circle. I had been the outcast, once the girl no one believed in. And now standing before me was someone whose life I'd helped change. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," I said finally. She nodded. "Because you showed me it was possible." We spent the next hour discussing her plans, expanding mentorship programs, creating startup grants for single mothers, developing a new leadership pipeline for underrepresented founders. She spoke with fire, with purpose, the same way I used to when I was her age. When she left, I stayed seated for a long time, staring out at the skyline. I thought of my father's trembling voice at the dinner table, my mother's apology, Ryan's quiet humility, Zoe's fierce optimism. All of it, the pain, the triumph, the rebuilding, had led to this. At noon, I walked down to the foundation's main floor. The walls were covered in photographs of people we'd helped: farmers, entrepreneurs, students, dreamers. Beneath each photo was a single quote: "Someone believed in me." That's what it had always been about, I realized. Not money, not recognition, just belief. In the afternoon, I had a press meeting scheduled, but instead of staying in the office, I decided to go to the kitchen where our staff often gathered for lunch. It smelled like coffee and fresh bread. A few employees looked surprised to see me there. "Don't mind me," I said, grabbing a sandwich. I needed real food and real conversation. One of the junior analysts smiled shyly. "We were just talking about how you started Morning Star." "How did you know it would work?" I thought about it for a second. I didn't. I just knew what I couldn't go back to. They nodded, listening quietly. "I failed more times than I can count," I continued. "But the truth is, failure's not the opposite of success. It's the foundation of it. Every mistake I made built something solid under me." The room was silent for a moment, then someone clapped. It was small, hesitant, but soon others joined in. I laughed, embarrassed. "All right, that's enough of that. Let's get back to work before you all start quoting me." When I returned to my office, Clara was waiting with a knowing look. "You're becoming a legend around here," she said. "Let's hope not," I replied. "Legends belong in the past. I'm still building." That night, I took the elevator up to the rooftop terrace. The city stretched out before me, lights shimmering like 1,000 tiny futures waiting to be written. I took a deep breath, the cold air biting at my lungs, and pulled out my phone. I opened my camera not to take a photo, but to record a message, a personal one, the kind I used to post on my private channel years ago when I was struggling. "Hi," I began. "If you're hearing this, maybe you've been where I was: broken, underestimated, tired of fighting battles you didn't choose. I want you to know something: the life you dream about isn't too big. It's just waiting for you to become brave enough to claim it." I paused, the wind tugging at my hair. "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone," I continued. "You just need to remember who you are when no one's watching. That's where power starts. Not in a bank account, not in a title, in belief." I ended the recording, saving it for later, and slipped the phone into my pocket. The city below seemed to hum with energy. The first stars began to pierce the night sky, the same sky that had watched me fall, rebuild, and rise again. This, I realized, was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not redemption, but legacy. The kind built on quiet, powerful impact, on the truth that success isn't about the name you carry, but the belief you pass forward. That was the real power, the one that never fades. If Emily's journey resonated with you, leave your thoughts below, because every story of resilience inspires the next one.